Good morning, viewers. In the previous lesson, Old Testament Narratives Part 1, we have seen that the children of Israel were chosen by God to reveal His power, His love, His greatness, and His promise to send a Savior, Jesus Christ, to die instead of man and take the wrath and punishment of God for their sins. We have seen that after the death of Moses, Joshua was leading and guiding the Israelites. Now, after the death of Joshua, God used several judges to lead them and guide them. Throughout the period of judges, Israel's behavior follows a consistent pattern. They fall into evil and wickedness. God gives them over to be oppressed by their enemies. They cry to God finally for deliverance, who sends a leader to deliver them. Once after the judges die, again the people go back to a cycle of committing greater and greater evil. Let us look at a few judges. At one time, Midianites invade the fields of Israelites, impoverish them and scatter them. God commissions a humble man, Gideon, to save Israel. Gideon and his few men surround the camps of Midianites as per God's plan. With just 300 men carrying trumpets and earthen jars, in the middle of the night they surround the Midianites. And at one time they all break their jars and shout in such unison that the Midianites in the middle of the night in confusion kill each other of their own countrymen. Another time, when Philistines oppress Israel, now it is the turn of Philistines. God blesses Samson with exceptional abilities, particularly physical stamina. One day, Samson kills a lion with his bare hands. Contrary to his parents' urging, Samson chooses a Philistine woman to be his wife. But with God's power, Samson breaks free and kills 1,000 Philistine men with the jawbone of a donkey. Samson again falls in love with a Philistine woman named Delilah. The Philistine officials urge Delilah to discover the secret of Samson's strength. 3 times Samson doesn't tell her the truth. But vexed with her, Samson tells her the truth, informing her that his hair is the source of his strength. He has long hair. While Samson is asleep, Delilah has his hair cut and calls the officials, Philistine officials, who capture him, gouge out his eyes and make him a prisoner. Samson, as a prisoner, one day is called out to entertain them during a huge Philistine religious festival. The blind Samson is led by the servant into this arena. Samson asks his guide to lead him to the pillars of the arena, and in his last act of majesty and mighty power, he cries to God and he brings down the pillars of the temple, and thus killing along with himself many Philistines, their rulers and their princes. Were there no women during this period of judges? The book of Judges narrates the story of a woman prophet named Deborah. As Israel's judge, she was also a counselor to Israel's tribe. One time, she calls Barak to lead an army or an insurrection against Sisera, a Canaanite general. But Barak insists that Deborah also accompany him. Together, with God's help, Barak and Sisera lead the Israelites and they defeat the Canaanites, who had 900 iron chariots. Sisera, the Canaanite general, was forced to retreat and he seeks refuge in a local woman's tent because he is tired from the battle. The owner of this tent, Jael, a woman, invites Sisera and gives him milk because he is hungry, and when he is fast asleep out of his tiredness and exhaustion, kills him by hammering a peg into his skull. This story is of particular importance because Barak, a man, fails to rise to the occasion and depends upon Deborah, a woman. And though Barak pursues and the enemy Sisera is eventually killed, it is all at the hands of a woman. Saul's last judge Samuel is born to Hannah, who is a barren woman for a long time. She dedicates young Samuel for God's work in the temple under the priest called Eli. Eli and his sons are actually disobedient to God's laws. Therefore, God chooses Samuel to be a prophet, and Samuel goes about delivering God's messages to the people. However, Israelites look at the nations around them who have kings and demand that they also have a king like the other nations. God and Samuel are displeased with their request, but however, God tells Samuel that Saul can be anointed as a king. Saul, a tall and handsome man, pleases the Israelites, and he leads them in many battles. Samuel encourages people that as long as they are obedient to God's laws, God will not punish them for their request of a king. Despite many military victories, unfortunately, Saul becomes proud and disobeys God. God therefore chooses Jesse's youngest son, David, a shepherd boy, as a king and gives him divine power. The Philistines again threaten to attack Israel, this time taunting Israel with their new hero called Goliath. Goliath is actually a man who is 9 feet tall and more than that. Saul and the Israelites actually, when they are called to fight against the Philistine Goliath and his army, keep running away because he is so tall. David, a very short man, actually came to deliver food to his brothers in the army, and he becomes very zealous for God and offers to fight this giant. David refuses the king's armor. He publicly invokes God's help and kills Goliath with a single stone shot from his sling. Naturally, David is given a hero's welcome, and Saul becomes very jealous. But he continues to be a shepherd. In fact, David and Saul's son Jonathan are bosom friends. However, in the course of time, in a battle with the Philistines, Saul, who continues to disobey God, and his sons, including Jonathan, are killed. After the death of Saul, David becomes a king, and he leads the Israelites in conquering the city of Jerusalem. Jerusalem is a strong Canaanite stronghold. One day, David, the king, watches a woman bathing from the rooftop of his palace. He falls into temptation, he succumbs into adultery, and the woman becomes pregnant with Bathsheba. This Bathsheba is the wife of his general Uriah. Unable to disguise his indiscretion, David sends her husband Uriah to die on the battlefield and secretly marries Bathsheba. But God, who knows everything, sends prophet Nathan to confront the king about his adultery and deception and seeming murder. And Nathan predicts that God will bring calamity on David's household for this wickedness. David immediately repents for his sin, and he fasts and prays so that the newborn son will not die. However, the newborn child dies. Afterward, David and Bathsheba have another son, Solomon. However, sin runs its course, and in the family of David, apart from this newborn babe, 3 other sons of David die on different occasions, violent deaths. Thus, God, who is a God of justice and moral sense, and his sense of justice and law is met. But King David is a favorite king of many. He composed many songs of praise to God for his loving kindness, and many songs of prayer because Saul was actually pursuing him to kill him. And some of these songs are recorded in the book called Psalms. Though David sinned, he was very humble and quick to confess. Therefore, God also called David as a man after his own heart. After David's death, Solomon succeeds King David. And before dying, David charges his son Solomon to remain faithful to God and his laws. Once Solomon becomes the king, God appears to Solomon in a dream and offers to grant the new king one boon or wish. Solomon very wisely asks for wisdom to govern with justice this huge nation of Israel. And God is so impressed with Solomon's humble request that he also blesses Solomon with great wealth and long life. With his vast resources, Solomon builds an elaborate temple to God as well as a palace for himself in Jerusalem. King Solomon's temple is lined with gold and features large hand-sculpted angels and pillars. God appears to Solomon once the temple is completed and gives him a testament or a covenant and says that as long as Solomon and the Israelites are obedient to his laws, Israel will be protected and his presence will be in the temple. But if they are disobedient, God will remove his presence from the temple and also destroy both this magnificent temple and the nation of Israel. Solomon's successes continue until he marries many foreign women. He seems to have weakness for women, and they influence him to worship false gods and idol worship. God is infuriated and tells Solomon that his kingdom will be dismembered or divided. Of course, but God is faithful to the covenant or the testament that he gave to David, and during Solomon's time, this kingdom is not divided. But in Solomon's son's time, Rehoboam's period, we find Israel is split into two kingdoms, the kingdom of Israel in the north and the kingdom of Judah in the south. These two kingdoms were always fighting against each other. And also they had to fight against their enemies, the Canaanite kingdoms like the Amorites, the Midianites, the Babylonites, the Assyrians. Unfortunately, most of the succeeding kings in both these kingdoms did more evil in God's sight than good. Almost all of Israel's northern kings commit great evil, each one outdoing their father in evil and wickedness. Some of the southern kings in Jerusalem, that is the kingdom of David, tried to revive obedience to God, but none of them really banned the worship of foreign gods or idolatry in Judah. One of northern Israel's most wicked kings is Ahab, who with the help of his wife Jezebel spreads idol worship false god Baal. Once this Baal worship is so prominent that Elijah, a prophet, informs Ahab that God will curse the land with great drought for more than 3 years. And Elijah lives on the outskirts of the civilization because he is afraid of this wicked king Jezebel. During this drought period, God wonderfully feeds Elijah by ravens, crows, and Elijah does a number of miracles for the local people. Elijah challenges the priests of Baal to contest and see whether God, Jehovah, the God of Israel, is the true God or Baal is a god. And there is a contest where Elijah challenges them to see who will sacrifice an animal, which God will answer the prayer and send fire from heaven. No fire from human side should come, but the animal should be consumed by heavenly fire. First, Elijah gives chance to the Baal worshippers. Despite animated prayer and self-mutilation and hours of prayer and chanting, the priests of Baal are unable to ignite fire on their altar. Finally, they give up in failure. And Elijah's turn comes and he tells people to soak the altar and the animal for sacrifice in water 3 times. It is completely drenched and covered in water. But when he prays the true God, fire comes down from heaven and engulfs the whole altar in flames. Later, Elijah appoints a new man called Elisha to be his apprentice and succeed him as a prophet. After a few years, Elisha has to witness Elijah being taken up to God in a miraculous manner. A chariot comes down from heaven and suddenly separates Elijah from Elisha. And as Elisha looks up, Elijah is carried into heaven by a flaming chariot, never to return. The whole of Bible, particularly the Old Testament, we come across 2 people who do not die a natural death. One is Enoch and another is Elijah. After the death of Elijah, Elisha, his apprentice, assumes Elijah's role as a prophet. Elisha does many wonderful miracles. A handful of Judah's kings make brave attempts at reform in the southern kingdom. 2 kings particularly embark on repairing the decaying temple in Jerusalem. When Hezekiah the king assumes the throne, he destroys the altars and idols in Judah. With the help of the great prophet Isaiah, there is economic and religious revival, and they stop the threat from Assyria. Another king, Josiah, in Judah's land, directs a national program of spiritual revival and renewal. He commands that the laws of Moses be read and obeyed. And he also renews and celebrates the Passover festival for the first time in many centuries. However, despite these attempts to turn the religious tide in Judah, evil continues, and after Josiah's death, the king of Babylon invades southern kingdom of Israel. King of Babylon burns Jerusalem and destroys the temple built by Solomon. Like their northern brothers, the people of Judah are also sent into exile. They live in Babylon, and you find the song by the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down and wept. Apart from the books that narrate the story of creation and history of Jews in the Old Testament, I told you already that there are books of poetry and prophecies. The book of poetry, among the books of poetry, the book of Job is a wonderful book to read. It is based on the story of Job, a wealthy man with his large family and extensive flocks. He is a righteous man and a God-fearing man. Satan challenges God that if God permits, Satan would trouble him and Job will turn and curse God. But God challenges Satan that Job will never commit sin. And so God allows Satan to torment Job to test this bold claim. But he tells Satan not to touch Job's life. In the course of one day, now Satan brings about so many calamities that Job receives 4 messages. And in one day, all these messages bring separate news that his livestock, his servants, his 10 children with their families all died due to enemy invaders or natural calamities and catastrophes. Satan once again goes to God and tells him, "You give me another chance to test Jacob, and this time he's surely going to curse you." This time God again says, "You are permitted, but you cannot touch his life." The second time, Job is afflicted with horrible skin sores. He has to sit and scratch himself amidst the loss of his personal and financial loss. His wife tells Job, What are you living? Why don't you curse God and die? But Job refuses. Job's three friends, interestingly, come to confront him, and they cause him more pain with their talk and insinuating remarks. And they spout poor and theologically unsound advice. But Job sustains his confidence in spite of these criticisms and responds saying, "My Redeemer, my Savior in heaven will vouch for my innocence." God finally encounters Job, who acknowledges God's unlimited power and admits his limitation and his own limited knowledge. In a miraculous manner, God returns Job's health, provides him with twice as much property as before. He has new children, 10 of them, and an extremely long life. Now, listeners, are you wondering what happened to Israelites in their post-exile period? Once God destroyed them and sent them as a punishment to other kingdoms, what happened to them? I would like to share with you two stories that are from the period of exile. One is about a young woman named Esther who risks her life to save the Jews in exile. And another is about a young man, Daniel, and his 3 young friends who witnessed to God for their faith. The book of Esther is a post-exile story. These Jews, many of them into exile, at one point some of them are used by Ezra and Nehemiah to come back. Ezra and Nehemiah, great leaders, are given permission by their exile kings to come back and build the kingdom and the temple. But some Jews stay back, and Esther is one such person. So in a foreign land, Esther is brought up by her uncle Mordecai because she is an orphan. Miraculously, she becomes the queen to the king of Persia, a great king. The king probably chose Esther because of her beauty and intelligence. However, her Jewish background and her uncle's background is not known to many people. Mordecai, an officer under the king of Persia, who is also Esther's guardian, refuses to bow down because the Jews are not supposed to bow down to any human being. He refuses to bow down to Haman, a high official of the king. Haman is very proud and infuriated. He plots to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. Mordecai hears of this plot, and he reports it to Esther, saying, "God has brought you to this place for this special occasion. If you as a queen remain silent at this time, God will bring relief and deliverance from some other place, but you and your father's household will perish." They have very strict laws, Persian kings, but Esther takes a risk, goes to the king without his being calling her, outwits Haman and takes her petition to the king and requests the protection of her Jewish people from Haman's wicked strategy. The king, knowing of this sudden plan, in his anger, decides to hang Haman on the gallows. These gallows are actually built by Haman to destroy Mordecai, and he also decides to send an order that all the Jews are supposed to protect themselves and kill their enemies. Thus, by the king's order and through Esther's faith and courage, Jews spare themselves from destruction by fighting back, and this is celebrated as a festival of Purim. Another story in the exile relates to Daniel and his 3 friends. Daniel and many people of royal lineage are among the Jewish captives who are brought to Babylon when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, invaded and conquered Jerusalem. Nebuchadnezzar decides to train these young nobles because Jews are very, very intelligent all over the world. They are known for the greatest discoveries. And Nebuchadnezzar decides to use these men for his administration. So he decides to call them into the palace, give them his food, his wisdom, his training. However, though they are in a strange land, in pagan culture, ungodly civilization and religion, they decide to take a stand for God and obey God. And God blesses them with both good health and tenfold greater wisdom than the others. One day, Nebuchadnezzar is disturbed by a dream, but he forgot his dream. He asks his own wise men to interpret the dream. They tell the king, "O king, you tell us the dream, we will tell you the interpretation." But the king has forgotten, and this is all planned by God. The king decides to destroy all the wise men in his kingdom because they are supposed to be wise enough to know what he dreamt and his interpretation. But Daniel requests the king for time. He and his friends pray to God for 3 days. After 3 days, God shows Daniel in a vision and his friends the dream and its interpretation. Thus, Daniel and his friends are promoted to high places in Babylon. Once, his 3 friends are once put in a fiery furnace because after this dream, Daniel decides to set up a huge idol, and he orders that all the people should worship this idol. But Jews are not supposed to worship any idols. And the enemies of Daniel and his friends tell the king that, "O king, these 3 young Jews refuse to worship your idol. They refuse to obey you." Naturally, the king got angry and he asked them, "Will you do it once again? Because otherwise, as per the laws of Babylon, you will be put into a furnace to die." The young Jews say, "O king, even if we die in the fire, we cannot bow down to your image because we worship the holy God." The king gets so angry, he charges the furnace to be heated 7 more times and puts these 3 young friends of Daniel into the fiery furnace. You know what happens? These 3 devout men are not only found walking alive in the fire, but as the king and others watch from a distance, they find a 4th figure, that is God himself, walking in the fire. The ones who actually throw these 3 men into the fire are singed to death. And immediately the king, looking at this wonderful sight, orders these 3 boys to come out. And as they come out, the 3 friends are elevated to great positions. And Nebuchadnezzar issues an order that all the people in his land should worship the God of these Jewish boys because he alone is a true God. Later, Daniel, again under another kingdom, Cyrus, is again having enemies and jealous people who bring about charges saying Daniel is worshipping the God. And Daniel is thrown into a lion's den. There again, God delivers Daniel from the lion's den. Despite the plan of God, the promises of God, the testament, the covenant that he establishes right from Adam and Eve, through his children, Noah, Abraham and Jacob and Joseph, people have failed. But God sends his son Jesus Christ. However, God chose the nation of Israel, the Jews. However, we see that to establish God's purpose, Israel is chosen, but they have been so wicked. Because of their wickedness, God, as a God of justice, has eventually punished them and sent them into exile. The Old Testament prophets also predicted the birth, death and resurrection of Messiah, Savior Christ. They prophecy about the punishment of the Jews. And we find that the Jews, because of their disobedience, have been sent into exile. They have been dispersed all over the world. And almost till 1960s, they never had a country or a land of their own called Israel. So we see that the Holy Bible is one unified thing. Right from Old Testament to New Testament, the hero of this great work is the Christ or the God. The Old Testament prophets who prophesied about the birth of Christ right from Genesis, we find it fulfilled in the New Testament, and the last book of the New Testament, the book of Revelation, ends with the second coming of Christ, when Christ is going to come into this world to judge mankind for their sins. All that man is supposed to do to accept Christ's forgiveness, to be reconciled to man, is just trust by faith in the finished work of Christ and accept the forgiveness that he is ready to offer. Thus you find that the whole of the Bible is one unified story. We find the unfolding of God's eternal promises for mankind, the whole of mankind, not just the nation of Israel. Only he chooses the nation of Israel to be his channel to accomplish his plans. And you find that the New Testament is complementing whatever the Old Testament has predicted. I hope you have also enjoyed, and see you in the next class.